Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. Let me begin with a few little disclaimers. So I didn't think I was going to be teaching today because, as you know, our system crashed and it surprisingly just was up and running a little while ago. And that caught me unprepared. I like to prepare before I teach. So it's not going to be the theory of everything. It'll be the theory of some things. Or maybe the theory of everything part one. Since we have a schedule to study Torah, I thought the right thing would be to do is to teach and share some words of Torah to the best of my ability. So that's disclaimer number one. Disclaimer number two. I don't think it's possible to appreciate anything we're going to talk about today without watching the previous episodes. So I'm strongly encouraging you, if you're joining for the first time and you're going to be frustrated because you don't understand what I'm talking about, you need to go back and watch those episodes, because these episodes really aren't standalone. One necessarily flows into and leads into the next. This is kind of like building a building, and you need a foundation. And number three, what we are about to begin to study is extremely, extremely profound. And as I've mentioned multiple times in this series, somewhat beyond us. I mean, we are, at best, able to understand abstract concepts in today's day and age because there's a lot of abstraction that's become part of our repertoire. Things like quantum physics, electronics. We have an understanding of sight and the waves that the eye is able to perceive, waves that light make. We have an understanding of sound and the Doppler effect. We know about infections. Essentially, because of quantum theory, we today are not entire strangers to the purely conceptual and the purely theoretical, which has made it somewhat easier to study Chassidus and Jewish mysticism. Having said that, it's a dangerous thing to do because you can literalize in a quantum fashion, in a physics fashion, the things that we're learning, and that just wouldn't be right. So Chassidus gives us a window into things that are inherently beyond our grasp, beyond our comprehension, as I've talked about so many times. Okay, so with those three disclaimers, if you're focusing on the Sha'ar B'tochen, welcome. It's good to see you all joining. If you're on Facebook, please hop on over to YouTube. There's a live chat, and I can see you. I mean, I can see what you say at least, so I can try to respond to your questions. The Alter Rebbe at this point is going to be talking about the Nimshal. We're on page Shin Nun Tes, if you're following along in the new print of the Siddur and Dach. Sha'ar HaTekiyot, the gate of Shofar blasts. Page 359 in the Hebrew, which would be 717 in the English, or regular numerals. And up until now, we've talked about mashal. A mashal is a paradigm, a metaphor, a parable. And then there's the nimshal. Then there's the actual point. You know, in the modern age, or the pre-modern age, there was a tremendous Torah scholar who is known for his uncanny ability to relate things to people by means of stories and metaphors. He was known as the Dubna Maggid, the Bank of Krantz. He was a Yaakov Noach Krantz, I think his name was. He was a student of the Vilna Gaon. And in the end, he wasn't pleased with the Vilna Gaon's opposition to Chassidus, but he never kind of made any move about that. Anyway, a lot to say about him. But he always had this marvelous story, marvelous mashal for any situation. And all of his teachings were in parabolic or storytelling or storyline. So somebody once said, they said, Dubna Maggid, how do you always have the perfect story, the perfect parable to illustrate a point? So the Maggid said, let me tell you a story. He said there was a fellow who came upon a clearing in the forest, and he noticed hundreds, maybe thousands of targets all around the clearing. Wood targets, clay targets, all kinds of targets. And what he noticed odd about whoever this fellow living in the clearing was, that he had this uncanny ability of always landing the arrow in the bullseye. There wasn't a single target where the arrow wasn't dead center in the bullseye. Thousands of arrows. It's just like, it's statistically impossible. So he goes over to this fellow and he says, are you an archer? And he says, yes. He says, you shot all those arrows? He says, yeah. He says, how do you do that? Dead center? Every one? I've never seen anything like this. So the archer said, it's simple. First I shoot the arrow, then I draw the circles. That is to say, the Dubna Maggid knew what he wanted to say first, and then he created a parable. Now there's no stories here. This is hardcore Chassidus. This is intense Jewish mysticism. This is where the stories end. The mashal, the metaphor, has been a phenomenon that we should be able to somewhat relate to because it's part of, well, our consciousness, who we are. You and I are all capable of speaking, Baruch Hashem. Not only are we capable of speaking, we're capable of thinking. We're also capable of intuiting or conceptualizing. So that process is something that we can talk about in a cogent way. And it's not unreasonable to talk about a person's first thoughts or first inspiration or original epiphany and how that develops, and to describe this alphabet, if you will, of unwritten characters or codes that populate the subconsciousness and how this filters into what we would call cogent thought or awareness, where people think in a particular language and then eventually how that can seed the feelings of the heart. That's S-E-E-D. And from those seeds, there's a blossoming, and there's an emotion that develops, and that emotion can eventually become expressed in an articulate fashion. So these are all the metaphors that we used. Everything I just said has been talked about at great length in the previous episodes. And one of the things that we highlighted more than I think anything else was the concept of memutza, the nexus, that shift, the transition from one reality to the next reality. And we clearly highlighted this idea that whenever there's a transition, there has to be like a transitional mechanism, something which is neither the full development, but it is no longer that which precedes the development either. It's whatever ideal we're talking about, it's in development. It's in a developmental state. It's in a so to speak, a transitional state. And this is called memutza, or connecting force. So that was all a mashal. And that wasn't so easy to understand, because we're not talking with things that we can touch or see. For the most part, it's not even things we can actually feel, at least not in an ordinary fashion. So what we're talking about then is part of the human experience, a very refined part or dimension of the human experience, a very lofty kind of consciousness. And the question becomes, so can we understand divine concepts? The idea of things like God's speech, God's articulation, by virtue of these metaphors? And the answer, of course, is that's precisely what this was about. So what we're trying to do is learn more about God, not about humanity. This is not a study of the humanities. This is not the origins of psychoanalysis per se, although many ideas that Sigmund Freud talked about like 2 centuries later, many of these ideas are found in Hasidic writings that preceded him, many of them, and other writings of Torah. But that's not what it's about. It's not the study of the human condition. It's a study of divinity, of Godhood. But since it is written, Mi bisari echze eleka, from my flesh, which is not understood, at least in Chasidic writings, as a literal expression from flesh or from corporeality or from the material dense life that we live, that we should be able to understand God. Mi bisari means from my material reality, from the life that I am capable of knowing and understanding, from who I am, from my consciousness, from my composite, I'm able to understand God. Echze, I can get a grasp, I can catch sight of Elikah, of God. And obviously, whatever we understand is never the essence or the full truth, because lo yirani ha'odam v'choyer, it is not possible for a human being to live in a terrestrial, literal sense and to have an apprehension of realities that are beyond this frame of existence. But we can have an understanding, and that's what we seek here. So if you've been following along, everything that we learned about in the previous episodes, all of which was metaphoric, all of which was taking us in a direction of trying to understand more about God. Yuvan lamaskil will be understood to the scholar. Now the maskil that's talked about here in the Maimer is a person who is proficient in the mystical dimension of Torah, a person who's a thinker, a person who has trained his or herself to think in abstract terms and is able to relate to abstract concepts, which, by the way, doesn't work for little children. You have to be mature. You have to have a mind that lends itself, or you have to want very, very strongly, very, very, very much so, to grasp these things. You have to work at it. Some people are natural. Some people have to work really hard at it. But if you're a maskil, whether by nurture or nature, a person who can understand these things and apprehend them, so the maskil will understand, Lamaila will understand how all this is but a metaphor for a deeper spiritual truth, that we don't have another methodology of grasping or understanding. We can only understand it by virtue of the things that we have a frame of reference for. We have a frame of reference for consciousness. We have a frame of reference for feelings. We have a frame of reference for engagement with those outside of us. We have a frame of reference which is called articulation or communication. These frames, not the physical, dense, actual element of it, these frames can serve to enable us to understand something about God on high. Just as in the previous episodes we talked about the letters, the unwritten letters that populate the mind. And we talked about the thought that actually uses language, but doesn't write language, not actual letters, or not the sounds of letters, but conceptual letters. And then we talked about the code of consciousness that precedes even cogent thought, which also has a code of sorts. Because it has to have some kind of mechanism, some kind of system in which to express itself or in which to exist. Everything has to have a frame. Everything has to be grasped. Everything has to be, so to speak, caught within a certain dimension, or we're not able to relate to it at all. So if I'm to have it, I have to grasp it some way. And if I'm to have consciousness, I need a code that the consciousness is comprised of. That code will eventually seed, C-E-D-E, to a different level. It will make a transition to seed, S-E-E-D, and it develops into what we're going to call cogent thought. Thought and consciousness, at least the higher level of consciousness, like wisdom, are not the same, as we learned. So all of this is going to help us to understand the concept of oisias, the concept of alphabet or letters, the code that God uses. And God uses speech. God uses this code in order to bring our world into existence. Now, our world, in the dense, material, actual, literal dimension, doesn't lend itself to any of this. We're not able to see any of this, but we can understand it. Mind you, nobody can see quantum physics. Nobody can see an atom. Nobody can see protons and neutrons or electrons, but we can understand them. Or at least maybe we can see it under a microscope and we can draw clear illustrations of it, which enables us to see it. But even if you don't look under a microscope, you can still understand it conceptually. This is a metaphor. This helps us to understand some of what we're talking about. And there are many levels of reality. There are many levels of understanding. There are many levels of existence. The same idea can exist in a physical, literal sense and be radically different. Let's talk, for example, about the concept of waste material. So in our world, there's always going to be waste, because in order for things to be able to, for lack of better terminology, reach a certain destination, they have to be trucked, they have to be rocketed, they have to be brought there has to be something. And invariably, whatever it is that delivers the payload is extraneous. It's only there as a means to an end. It's not the purpose itself. A simple, maybe silly example almost is when they send a rocket ship into outer space, when they break the gravitational boundaries of our atmosphere. So there's an enormous amount of fuel that it takes, an enormous amount. But then once the fuel is spent, the fuselage is just dead weight. So what happened is the scientists devised this amazing idea. This is before the space shuttle, the first iteration of the rocket, but the space shuttle, it also fell off. These gigantic tanks of gas just fell off. Because you didn't need it. And then of course, you had to take a space shuttle from wherever it landed and you had to bring it back to Cape Canaveral, and that wasn't so simple. That you needed all kinds of trucks for, because it couldn't fly. It can't fly in the atmosphere in a typical sense. So if you wouldn't have the fuselage, if you wouldn't have these enormous tanks of gas attached to it, or in the early rocket ships, you wouldn't have these enormous tanks underneath the actual capsule, would you ever get the capsule or the shuttle into outer space? Of course not. Of course not. You need to have the gas. So why do you need to have the silo? Ask, why do you need to have the fuselage? Why don't you just send it up with the gas? Because the gas has to be contained some way. And as long as it's contained, then it's able to be consumed. And through its incineration, we create raw energy, and through the energy, we can propel the rocket. So we need to have letters. The letters are like the fuselage. The letters are like, we need these letters. These letters are conveying something. The value isn't in the letter itself, it's in the energy. But in order for that energy to be conveyed, we need to have alphabets. We need to have vehicles, conventions. We need these envelopes, these fuselages to be able to deliver it. So when we're talking about Oisias HaMachshava, and we're talking about Oisias HaDibur, God doesn't have speech or thought, chas v'shalom. How could God have speech or thought? The concept of thinking is anathema to a divine being, at least the thinking that we know. For example, a person could say, I was thinking about it. So I used to think about it this way, and then I came to think about it otherwise. And I thought this and this was the case. Now I realize, in fact, it's not the case. So whenever we're talking about thinking about something, we're talking about something which is trapped within the vicissitudes of time, the past, present, and the future. Maybe not in a literal way. Maybe we don't measure it in a literal way, but there's the before I thought about it, there's I'm thinking about it, let me think about it, and then, I thought about it. So I didn't know or understand what was going on. I thought about it a lot, and you know what? I came to an awareness. I came to an understanding. So now, please don't disturb me when I'm thinking, because I'm really still thinking about it. I finished thinking about it. Okay, now I got it. So when we're talking about thought, we're talking about something which can't be godly, because the nature of thought is I have to think about it. I have to learn it. I have to know it. I have to understand it. That can't apply to God. God is all-knowing. God can't learn things. He doesn't get older. If God gets older, and God gets more mature, or God gets wiser, he's not God. Then he's a created being. He's not an omnipotent. He's not an eternal being. And of course, being is just a euphemism. So we can't talk about thought when we speak about Hashem. It's inherently wrong. It's almost like heretical. Speech? What, does God have a larynx? Does he have a tongue? Does he make noise? How could you use speech? The concept of speech is so human. It's so ungodly. And yet, we use the metaphor of speech very, very often, especially with regard to creation and God's communication. So the question, of course, is, how does that work? And the answer invariably is, it works metaphorically. It's something that enables us to understand something about God. We could just throw our hands up and say, listen, can't understand anything about God. It doesn't make any sense to us. He is not in our realm. He created us in a different dimension. Why bother? YOLO, you only live once. Just have a good time and that's all. That's not what we believe in. in case you thought it was. We believe that Hashem created you and I with a mission and a purpose. And we believe that we, as human beings, are meant to know God to the best of our ability. And we yearn for the coming of Mashiach, for example, because when Mashiach comes, we will know God. And if we actually are yearning for that, we should try to know as much about God as possible. And that's why the Arizal says that it's a mitzvah Rama v'nisah. It's a very lofty and important mitzvah to learn about Seder Ishtalshlos, to learn about the whole spiritual cosmology of what makes the world exist, or the theory of everything. Why? Why? Because do you want to know about God? You just want to serve God without knowing about Him? Why wouldn't you want to know God? You should want to know God. You should care about knowing God. It's the only way we can actually serve God wholeheartedly. As it says, Da es elikei avicha ve'avdehu b'leiv shalom. You have to know your God in order to serve Him wholeheartedly. So when we were gifted the teachings of Chassidus, which enable ordinary people like us to be able to know God in a far more profound way than ordinary people were ever able to before, we should embrace this. We should say, wow, teach me Torah. This is amazing. I get to know God far more than previous generations were able to know Him. So it's a gift. That's what we're trying to do now. So we're trying to know God. And we're learning that there's Oisiyas HaMachshava, that there's Oisiyas HaDibur, that there's letters of thought, or the letters of what you're going to call communication. And what does that mean? Dehini Yadua, behold it is known, Shebeyud Nivra Ha'olam Haba, that the world to come, and of course here the world to come means to come for me and you. It's extant right now, not in a physical space. It's not like that. It's not any different than a song being defined by a color or amount of space it takes up. I hope they don't invent too many songs, because at some place we're going to run out of space to store all these songs. What does that even mean? It's ridiculous. A song doesn't take up any space. Maybe the musical notes take up space on a paper, and maybe the stereo sound is going to be able to store tunes, if you will, in the computer, but they can run out of space. But sound itself, concepts themselves don't take up any space. So we're not talking about a spatial thing. We're talking about worlds that exist, and this is known idea. By the way, this known idea is the Gemara Meseches Menachos on page Chavtes, and it's also found in the Bereshis Rabbah in chapter 12. We're going to take a look at the Gemara because it's more explicit in the Gemara. And I'm going to show you how this idea is talked about in an exoterical, or at least in a Talmudic text. And then we'll see how we view it from a mystical perspective in a way that's relatable, understandable to all of us. So it's known that biyud nivra ha'olam haba, that the world to come, which is the world to come for us, non-spatial, a dimension of existence that's beyond us right now, that was created with a yud. Shehu b'chinas ois aleph me b'chinas oisius me machshavti yisbarach. That's a letter of God's thought, not of God's speech. Because God's speech is quantum physics. That's what creates the physical world. Of course, all this is a metaphor. But nonetheless, God's speech is what creates the literal material world. But olam haba, the realm of spirit, that's created through God's, so to speak, machashava, through God's thoughts. Metaphor, obviously. But nonetheless, a metaphor that's meaningful, that's teaching us something. So that's what the Gemara says. The Yud creates the Olam Haba, and that's Ois Aleph. It is a letter. One could argue the tiniest letter, the smallest amount of ink. That's an Ois Aleph, beginnes machshavte yisbarach, from God's proverbial thought. And then there's the Behei Nivra Ha'olam Haza. There's with the Hey that the Olam Haza, that the material quantum physics world is created. Shehu b'chinas oisius hadibur elyon. This is what we call God's proverbial speech. So the Alter Rebbe is dividing between the Yud and the Hey, saying that the Yud represents the letters of thought, the alphabet or stream code of consciousness, and the Hey represents the verbalized, articulated alphabet, which is, if you will, actuated into a world or dimension that feels entirely independent and separate from God. That's our world, you and I, and everybody around us. And that comes from the proverbial Oisius Hadibur. V'hu, Inyan Alman Steeman, v'alman des galien. Here, the Alter Rebbe has highlighted a concept which is referred to in Zoharic terminology as the hidden world and the revealed world. The hidden world is, in the metaphor, the world of thought. It's hidden from everybody else around me. It's within me. It's my own private thoughts. And then there's the spoken word. I can't know what you're thinking. I can know what you're saying. Now, you may not be saying what you're thinking, but I can only know what you're saying. That's the revealed world, so to speak. So there's an element of divinity or a world which is entirely concealed, and then there's the world which is overt and obvious. And that's the metaphor of speech. Now, it ends right there. So going back to our waste example, our toxins example, everything has toxins. So, there's a halacha that says that before a person prays, he has to empty his bowels. It's considered disrespectful, and it disables focus and concentration when a person's got to relieve himself. This is one of the most basic needs that human beings have, and inasmuch as hunger is an inherent part of who we are, and you might feel hungry, and by the way, it's not a good idea to daven when you're hungry, as per the famous maxim of the Rebbe Tzemach Tzedek, Beser essence liben davenen, vidavenen liben essen. It's better to be hungry and then eat something first and then daven than to daven first although you're hungry. So because when you're davening, all you're thinking about is the food, and you're davening for the food. So instead of davening to God, you're davening thinking about food. That's not good. It's much better to take something to eat so that you can now focus on the davening and be fully focused. So you're davening not in order to eat, but you're eating in order to daven. And this is very interesting because in halacha, you're really not supposed to eat before davening. So the understanding is that here, this is not called eating per se. The eating is only a part of davening. It's a preparation for davening. It's being done in order to daven. So you don't have a meal, but you nibble at something, a taste of something. So that's a basic need. But even more basic need, if you will, is the need to relieve yourself afterwards, after you've taken in the food. And the food, of course, is very refined. What you actually hold on to is it's almost like energy. It gets absorbed into the blood. And what happens to the food that delivered all that energy? The answer is it gets pushed back out. It's almost the same volume in, almost the same volume out. Whatever you take in, you have to give out. Minus the vitality, minus the energy. And therefore it's disgusting, it's dirty, it stinks. It's sewage. So that sewage becomes really a metaphor for what life can oftentimes be. We have to deal with the realities as they are because that's the only way to be able to get the nourishment. And when you have to go, you have to go. It's much worse than hunger. So you're not allowed to pray when you have to go. So you have to empty yourself. So the Rebbe Rashab in a Maimer says that just as the Gemara tells us one has to empty his bowels in order to recite the Shema, to be Mekabel El Malchus Shemaim, to accept upon yourself God as the yoke of heaven, and to be able to pray, to connect to Hashem. You cannot connect to Hashem when you're thinking about it. I need the washroom. Is it over yet? So he says that really a person should empty themselves from thoughts that are mean and capricious and selfish, from thoughts of anxieties and worries. The things that make human beings who human beings are. Human beings and all their foibles. And you have all these inappropriate, or at least unwholesome, kinds of thoughts. So the Rebbe said, it says you have to be mefana yourself. You have to empty yourself. He said it means mefana, and a deeper level means to empty yourself of all these desires, to empty yourself of all these thoughts, all these concerns. Empty that. So it's like going to the washroom. Now, obviously, there's a world of difference between emptying your mind or clearing your mind of the things that worry and take up space. It's very different than physically emptying one's bowels. Like, you don't need a toilet here. You don't have to flush it. You don't have to clean it. It doesn't leave any stench behind. Whereas emptying your bowels does exactly that. So it's not actually the same thing. But metaphorically, it's exactly the same thing. On a literal level, they're worlds apart. Worlds apart between, okay, now I'm going to focus and think, or I'm going to go to the washroom. One is entirely physical, and one is much loftier, much more conceptual, or even spiritual. However, It's the same halacha. It's the way that halacha is understood on a deeper level. So when we're talking about B'Yud Ke Hashem Tzuri Lamim, there's the way to understand this, as the Gemara talks about it, and then there's the way Chassidus talks about it. So just to, for the completion, so to speak, of the subject, let's take a look in the Gemara. Let's see what the Gemara says. This is the Gemara in Maseches Menachos, Adaf Chav Tesam and Beis, about halfway through the page. The Gemara says like this. Rabbi Yehuda Nasiya asked a question of Rabbi Ami. And the question was, Mai Dichsiv, what is the meaning of the verse? This is a verse which is found in the prophecies of Yeshayahu HaNavi on the 26th chapter. So what is the meaning of the verse? Bitchu b'Hashem adei ad. Trust in Hashem for eternity. Bitchu means to trust, and the trust means to have no worries, no concerns, nothing that takes up any space in your hard drive. You're able to be fully tranquil, and you put yourself entirely into Hashem's hands. And it's called bitachon, it's called trust. So the Gemara says, so what is the meaning of Bitchu b'Hashem adei ad? Ki, because B'Yud-Kei Tzurei Lamed, because God formed the worlds, or the worlds are formed B'Yud-Kei. So it's a pasuk. It's a pasuk in Yeshayahu HaNavi. It's the 26th chapter. It's the 4th verse. So the Gemara asks, what is it teaches this teaching from Rabbi Yehuda Bar Eloi? And he said like this. Amar le, kol hatoila b'tchoinoi, anybody who places his or her security in God, God becomes his shield, protector, in this world and the other world. So he said, he retorted, this is what I'm asking you. I understand what that means. I know what means bitchu b'Hashem. I know what means trust in Hashem. And I know that trust in Hashem earns us God's blessings, and God will shield and watch over us. Okay, I got that, he says. What I'm really asking is, why does it say ki yud-kei? It says bi yud-kei, with yud-kei. Yud-kei is the name of Hashem. Why doesn't it say ki ko Hashem, ki yud-kei, tzurei lamed? Because God forms the world. God forms the world. So what are you worried about? He's in charge. He forms the spiritual realm, he forms the material realm, and he doesn't give the keys away. So just trust in him. Hashem is going to work things out. Why have anxieties and worries? And that's what he responds. That's what it means. Put your trust in Hashem. He says, I know, that wasn't my question. I can read Hebrew too. That's a straightforward meaning. My question is, why does it say ki b'yud-kei? Why doesn't it say, if you want to say that God is tzurei lamim, it should say ki Ka tzurei lamim, because Yud-Kei is the one who forms the world. That's the source of the world's existence. Its formation is being brought into reality. What's Bi-Yud-Kei? So that's how he clarifies his question. And the response is, K'dedorash Rabbi Yehuda bar Rabbi Eloi. This is in keeping with the exposition of Rabbi Yehuda bar Eloi, who said like this. Yud-Kei tzurei lamim elu shnei elu mishabar HaKadosh Baruch Hu. This refers actually to two worlds that God created. And the two worlds are Olam Hazeh and Olam Haba. Echad b'hayud, b'hei ve'echad b'yud. One with a hey, one with a yud. And then the Gemara goes on to say, Eni yedea me'elam haba b'yud ve'elam hazeh b'hei. How do I know which is which? How do I know what's a yud and what's a hey? And the Gemara says, me'elam haba b'yud ve'elam haba b'hei. As it says, K'dechsiv eila told us shamayim v'aretz b'hi barim. These are the generations, if you will, or the narrative of Shemayim V'aretz. And it says, Behi Baram, as they were created, and we have a tradition that it's not Behi Baram, it's Behei Baram. He created them with a Hey. So we see here that this then is the concept of the Hey, that this world is created with a Hey. So the Gemara goes on to ask, okay, so what does that mean? What does it mean created with a Yud? And the Gemara gives us like a metaphoric answer, that life in this world is like a hay, that there's this big abyss on the bottom, and it's so easy to fall through the holes, fall through the cracks. That's what Elam Hazah, this world is built, like almost enables and allows for people's foibles and failures, but you can crawl out of it. Like the Mepharshim talk about, like the natural predisposition of a person is fall through the cracks. Doesn't happen. Nobody has to work at falling through the cracks. You have to just stop working on keeping yourself afloat. But to extricate yourself from the dregs and to be able to go into a higher place, that takes tremendous effort, and that's the idea of the top of the hay. So you can fall down in this world into the abyss, but if you can pull yourself out, you can emphasize the concept of being able to escape, which is the top of the hay. There's a space between the roof of the hay and the left ois. And that's essentially the Gemara's read on Biyud Ke Hashem Tzuri Lamed. Now, there's some very unusual verbiage from Rashi over here about Sefer Yetzirah, about drops of proverbial metaphorical ink, creating four worlds. I'm just saying, I'm just putting it out there that when you read the Gemara, it's the whole hay is but a metaphor for life. So Yud doesn't have a metaphor, and it's not inherently a Yud or a Hey. Whatever, the shape of the Hey is like this. So this is the ethical message we're able to glean from it. What does it actually mean, though? What does it mean that God created the higher worlds with a Yud? What does it mean He created the lower worlds with a Hey? We don't have an explanation in Nigla. Doesn't really make sense. Whatever, it's euphemistic, as they say, at best. But here, the Alter Rebbe is coming to explain it, literally, quite literally, that the Yud represents something, the Hey represents something, and its representation therefore leads the Yud to create Olam Haba, the world to come, and the Hey to create Olam Hazeh. And it's to be taken quite literally. I mean, non-literally, literally. So there's Dibur HaElyon, and then there's Machshav Elyon. And just as it is with a person, that when you speak, others are able to know what's in your mind, but when you don't speak, when you don't articulate it, it remains within you. So it is also within creation. There is the hidden creation, the creation that isn't and doesn't feel independent of God, whose creatures are subsumed into divine awareness, and they're not like outside of or separated from God. And then there's us. And we live in a world that's very much, it seems, separated from God. It's a revealed world. It's an open world. It's an overt world. We question if there's a God altogether. The material, physical world, we see and we know very clear, very profoundly. So the Alter Rebbe is saying that the Eisius HaDibur HaElyon, this is the idea of Alman Stimen. When we talk about the higher alphabet, when we talk about the code of consciousness, that's talking about what we call a higher world. And when we talk about speech, which in the metaphor is what's known to others, that's the element of divinity which allows for, so to speak, others to exist. This is medically referred to as divine speech. Ukamoi, for example, when we start to speak about the conjunction of different letters to form different words, different words which are independent of the person who's saying them. So then just as when a person speaks, there's a memutza, There's a transitional point where one goes from subconsciousness into a state of cogent communication. So just as we have a memutza within a transitory point or a transitional, transformational kind of reality, in the physical material metaphor or parable we used, when it goes from thought to speech, so too also when we speak about God's creation, which is also created from Eisius Hadibur. What comes from what's called the level of Bina of Atzilos, in Alma des Gallian, Shenivru, Bechinas Eisius Hadibur, that they give birth to, if you will, or are able to engender this concept of the spoken letter. And just like by Tzirufa Eisius Hadibur Elyain, Sheklalos, Hey, generally speaking, when we talk about the higher concept of letters or alphabet, Hey is the letter. Why is Hey the letter? Why isn't that Aleph for base? And the answer is Shein Hey Meitzoas Hapeh, because there are 5 guttural sounds that's made by a person. The sound, as we discussed, can be divided into making 5 different sounds. So it is also just like there's a memutza, a transitional point from thought into speech, so it is also on high. Yesh bechinas memutza shemevi ashpa bechinas hevela elyon. There's a memutza that brings it from what's proverbially spoken of as the fervor, the passion, the tempest in the heart, which this is found in the world of Zah. In the world of Zah, Zah stands for Ze'er Ampen. Now, Chassidus talks about the divine persona in human terms. So there's Arech Ampin and Ze'er Ampin, which is Zoharic terminology for the large face and the small face. And when we speak about face, it's related to the Hebrew word Pnimiyut, that which is on the inside. You cannot look at somebody's elbow and know, it looks like he's in a bad mood. Or, that's a very wise looking elbow. That's a profound looking shoulder. Shoulder and elbow doesn't tell you what's going on inside. It's only on the surface. So you look at somebody's face, it says Chochmas Adam Toyer Ponov, the wisdom, or maybe lack thereof, illuminates, or lack thereof, the person's face. So you know how intelligent the person. Some people look intelligent, and some people don't look intelligent at all. You got to wonder sometimes. So this idea of this proverbial window to the soul, the way to know what's going on inside, is unique to face. So there's Arech Ampin, large face, which is a metaphor for a lot of Pnimiyut. And then there's Ze'er Ampin, a little bit of Pnimiyut. And this is, generally speaking, the divide between the divine intellect and the divine emotions. The intellect is objective. It is cool, it's dispassionate. It doesn't get involved. It doesn't have an opinion. It doesn't feel strongly. That's a feeling. Feelings engage others. A person could think and contemplate and imagine things and have nobody else to speak to. And that's perfectly fine, but a person cannot have social activity with his or herself. You need to engage with others. Even loners still like to have some kind of social or limited social interaction. It's inhumane not to have a social interaction with others. That's why a punishment that they have in these awful boot camps is like putting somebody in a prison is a terrible thing. The worst of all, solitary confinement. Why? Because they can't communicate. The human being is built to communicate. We need to engage. We need to socialize. And these different elements of who we are. One is Arech Ampin. This is really who I am, how my thoughts, my understanding of things. And then there's how I relate, how I engage. That's Zoh. So when we talk about the Leva Elyon, when we talk about the divine heart, we're obviously not talking about ventricles. We're not talking about a muscle. We're talking about somebody that pumps blood. That's ridiculous. That's a metaphor when we speak about God. But it's the concept then of the idea of feelings, of relating, the divine psyche, the God himself, if you will, relating. That's called Zoh. So we have to have a memutza when we're going from Hevel Aleva Elyon, when it's going, just like when a human being goes from a passion and it goes into words, so too when a person is going, when it comes to God, and God is going to be creating a world in which there is a proverbial other, So then in order for that to happen, there has to be a mamutza, a transition, a nexus, but it means a certain transition. So the metaphor is hey. Why the hey? The midas da. It actually comes out of the heart. People say, like when they were frustrated or excited, it's a ha. So that's a hey. And that hey that comes out of the heart, and here we're getting to a whole new kettle of fish, what means Kol Hashem B'Koyach. And we're going to talk about Chavches Asvan, the Tzir of Adnai. We'll talk about the code of 28 different conjunctions, which are made up of Adnai, one of the letters of the name of Hashem. This goes through a whole Kabbalistic jargon, which I'm not going to touch upon today. So the point that we are making here is that there needs to be a metaphor within divinity, where we go from the world of thought or the world of conceptualization, divine conceptualization, which is what creates Olam Haba, the world to come, and then God actually creating our physical, material world. All of this and much more will help us set the stage eventually to finish this mimer and to understand the Kavanas of Baal Shem Tov. Thank you so much for joining today. I'm apologizing for the less than perfect delivery in class. And with Hashem's help, we'll continue to do the best we can and hear good news and share good news. Be'ezrat Hashem, tomorrow evening there will be another class. You're all welcome.